Hi, and welcome to Caterpillar Cross Stitch. My name is Ford, and this week I'm going to walk you through the steps that I take when getting ready to stitch a project not from a kit. This topic is actually in response to a viewer question, so if you have something that you'd like to see me cover, put it in the comments down below and make sure that you subscribe to the channel and turn on that little notification bell so that you don't miss when your topic comes up. You can also propose topics in the social media spaces of Caterpillar Cross Stitch, the Facebook group or in the following of the Instagram. I haunt those frequently, but also they'll pass those along to me if you have a topic you want to talk about there. If you've only ever worked from kits, working from a digital pattern or from a printed pattern can be a little bit intimidating because you might not know what floss to get or how much of it to get or what size fabric to get or any of that stuff. I'm going to talk you through how to figure all of that out and the ways that I prepare when I'm starting a new project. So the first thing that I do is I want to get my floss. Now I already have a very large collection of floss, so most of the time I'll assemble my floss just from my existing stash, but it's always a good idea to make sure that you have the right ones. And if you're getting started out, you probably don't have the thousands of colors that I do, and you might need to head to the craft store. So how do you know which ones to get? Well, I've got an example pattern here that I created for one of my previous videos, and it tells me, as any good cross-stitch pattern should, what colors are included in it. Now, sometimes they're not nice enough to list them in numerical order, so it makes it a little bit harder to make a shopping list. But you'll want to make sure that you have all of those colors available to you. Now, a good pattern will also usually tell you how many stitches there are of each color, as well as how many skeins that works out to. Now, this is obviously a very small pattern, so it's only going to use a very small amount of floss. But when you get into a larger project, you might have to worry about having to get more than one skein of a particular color. Now, not all patterns will tell you that. Sometimes they'll give you the floss usage in meters, and sometimes they'll give you sometimes they won't give you floss usage at all, only give you the number of stitches. So personally, I look at the number of stitches, and since I usually stitch with 2 strands on 14 count, my rule of thumb is that I get about 2,000 stitches per skein of floss. If you're using more strands, or if you're using a higher count fabric, then that's going to change. And there are some really useful resources out there to help you know how many that you're going to do. As a rule of thumb, I suggest getting 1 skein of floss for every 2,000 stitches. So then from there, I can compare my floss list to my stash. Or if I'm planning to just kit it all up fresh, then I can just make a shopping list of what I need. I need a skein of 153. I need a skein of 310, for instance. And you'll help yourself out when you get to the craft store if you make sure that even if the pattern isn't, if your shopping list is in numerical order, it'll make it a lot easier to find each skein that you need. And if you want to make sure you don't miss any upcoming Caterpillar Cross Stitch stitch-alongs, projects, retreats, socials, news, make sure you sign up for the Stitch Club newsletter. There's a link in the description, and I will pin one in the first comment. But when you sign up, you'll also get 10 free PDF cross-stitch patterns worth £60 and our top 10 cross-stitching tips. So make sure you hit one of those links down there. So once I've made my shopping list for my floss, then I need to decide how big of a piece of fabric I'm going to get. And that is unfortunately going to, again, require some math, or some maths, depending on what side of the pond you're on. You didn't know the cross-stitching was going to involve so much math, did you? Well, it's too late now, you're hooked. The calculation to figure out how big a project is going to end up is really a pretty simple one. All you have to do is calculate the number of stitches that the project's size is, divide that by the count of the fabric, because the count of the fabric is in stitches per inch. So 14 count fabric means that it has 14 stitches per inch. Now that does get a little bit more complicated if you're going to use a higher count fabric like linen or jobalon. I will probably cover that in a future video. But what we want to know is how many stitches the project is and how many stitches per inch we're going to be doing. And most of the time that's the same as your fabric count. So for this project, if I'm looking at here, it tells me how big my project is. 24 by 32 stitches. So if I'm going to stitch that on 14 count fabric, 14 is my fabric count, 24 is my project size. I'm going to wind up with 1.71 inches. And for my other count, I've got 32 stitches. That's my height of my project. So I'm going to do the same calculation. 32 stitches divided by 14 stitches per inch gives me a height of 2.29 inches. Now I'm going to round those to the nearest quarter inch, so I've got 1 3/4 inches by 2 1/4 inches. Those little 0.04 inches is not going to be significant enough for us to need to carry those through in our calculations. So I know my project is going to wind up basically 1 3/4 inches by 2 1/4 inches. Now with any size project, this math is going to hold the same. So you'll want to just figure out how big the finished project is going to end up by dividing stitch count by stitches per inch. That will give you how many inches. Now we know how big our project is. That is the start of how big we want our piece of fabric to be. But the thing to remember is that you are not going to be using all of your fabric. You need some space for your hoop or your Q-snap or whatever you're going to use to hold your project. Even if you're stitching in hand, you need some place for your fingers to hold on to it. You also need some space around the outside for putting it into a hoop or into a frame or finishing it into a pillow or whatever you're going to do with the project when you're done. You need some extra space for that. And if you don't have enough space, if you only leave yourself like 1/2 inch or something like that, you will regret it when it comes time to display that project. Now, this is a place where I have many times in the past caused myself trouble by being a cheapskate. I'll be like, I could get away with only this much extra margin on it. But every time I do it, me of the future cusses out me of the past for being such a cheapskate. There's a difference between being cheap and being frugal. Being frugal is not spending money that you don't have to spend. Being cheap is not spending money that you really do have to spend. That's the difference. So I try to be frugal and not be cheap. So when choosing the size of your project, even if it is a small project like this one, you want to have 3 inches of space all the way around. Now that can get a little bit confusing because people hear that and they think, oh, I need to add 3 to my size. But if this is our project here, which is 1 3/4 inches wide and 2 1/4 inch tall, in order to be able to frame it and display it, I'm going to want 3 inches on the top, 3 inches on the bottom, 3 inches on the left, and 3 inches on the right. So I'm actually going to be adding 3 to each dimension twice. I'm going to be adding a total of 6 inches. Now, if you've got just the right perfect piece of fabric and you can't find a bigger one, or to get a bigger one would involve spending a whole bunch more money, you can fudge this a little bit. Like, you can get away really with doing 2, but you will probably regret it if you do. So if it is an option for you to do the full 3 inches top and bottom, 6 inches total, I strongly recommend that you do that. So with a project of 1 3/4 inches by 2 1/4 inches, I want a piece of fabric that is 7 3/4 inches by 8 1/4 inch. That's how big I want my piece of fabric. So then I'm going to make a note of that on my shopping list, along with all of the colors of floss that I'm going to get when I go to the craft store. Or if you're ordering it online or whatever, you can just get one piece of fabric that will be able to accommodate a cut of that size. And then the last thing I'm going to want to get is a needle. So you can check out my video on needle sizes, but the rule of thumb that I'm going to give you is that the tapestry needle size should have the same last digit as the fabric count. So if you're using 14 count fabric or stitching 28/2 for a total of 14, you're going to want a size 24 tapestry needle. 16 count, size 26, 18 count, size 28. Now, different manufacturers and different post processes and different ways of handling and dyeing fabric will change how tight the weave is. So that is just a rule of thumb. Again, check out that video on needle sizes to make sure that you're not using the wrong size needle, because it does cause a lot of distress. But that is the rule of thumb that I'm going to give you. So make sure you get an appropriate size needle while you're at the craft store. Then everything else that we're going to do is after we go to the craft store. Hey, if you're ready to try something new, check out Caterpillar Crochet. It's the same amazing supportive community that you're used to with beginner-friendly kits and projects. Come and join us on Facebook or on Instagram to get started in a whole new craft. So once I've gotten my floss and my fabric and I've come back from the craft store, then I'm going to want to prepare all of my supplies. The first thing I want to do is make sure that my fabric is not going to fray. There are a couple of ways that I will do that. If I already have the sewing machine out, I will grab the sewing machine and I will use a zigzag stitch or an overlock stitch along the edge of that fabric. Again, I've made a video tutorial about how to do that, but if I don't already have the sewing machine out, or I'm feeling too lazy, or I'm not at home, then what I will do is I will blanket stitch the edge of my project fabric. So once I've cut it to the appropriate size, I will just put a blanket stitch around the edge. And again, I have a video about how to do that right there. And then the last thing I'm going to do with my fabric is I'm going to mark the center of it so that I know where to start with my project. So the way that I do that is I just take my fabric, and obviously I haven't blanket stitched this piece yet, but I fold it in half lengthwise, and then I fold it in half shortwise, whatever the opposite of lengthwise is. And I just give a little bit of a press right at that corner there. And that's going to create a little bit of a crease so that I'll be able to see where the center is. And then I'll open it back up. And now this is the thing that I've started doing that saves me a lot of hassle later, which is I will just mark the center of that piece with a needle. And I will point my needle at the top. Because sometimes, especially if it's almost square, it's really hard to tell which was the long side and which was the short side. So when I mark the center of the project fabric with my needle, I just make sure that my needle is pointed at the top, so that once I have the fabric loaded into my hoop, I'll be able to tell which direction that's supposed to go. Because again, I've caused myself a big problem by forgetting which way was up, stitching my project sideways, and not having enough room for it to fit. And I've seen a lot of other people have the same issue. So this is a tiny little thing that I can remember to do that saves me a lot of hassle later. Now with that done, you're going to want to organize your floss. Now, I like to keep my floss on bobbins because I like to carry my projects around in a little floss box like this, and that doesn't really work very well with skeins. So I tend to keep my floss on bobbins. Now, if you use floss away bags, or if you use floss drops or stitch bows or whatever it is that you like to keep your floss on, that's great. This is just the way that I like to do it. But there is one thing that can be very helpful no matter what your floss organization system is, and that is to mark your floss storage system with the symbol that corresponds to that color for this project. So if you're using floss away bags, you can just write it on a little piece of paper and put it in the bag with it. If you're using bobbins like me, you can just draw the symbol that corresponds to that color on the bobbin. Now, I do reuse my bobbins, and I will just use a Q-tip with a tiny little bit of rubbing alcohol, or really any kind of alcohol, to erase this symbol from it later. So in addition to the color number, I will draw the symbol of that color on the bobbin. But like I said, whatever storage system you're using, you can do the same thing. This really helps avoid confusion later, particularly if you have colors within the project that are pretty similar and not so easy to tell apart on site. And then I will just wind the floss onto my bobbins and put them into my project box. I usually keep a separate box or bag for each project that I'm working on so that they don't get mixed up. And then the final thing I'll do is I'll decide where I'm going to start on my project. Now, any good pattern should come with some sort of markings that tell you where the center is. So on this one here, we've got a little arrow here and here. On the Caterpillar ones, you've got a big red line that runs through the pattern, makes it really easy. This one's not quite so easy, so I'm just gonna make that mark here. That is the center of my pattern. Everybody says you should start in the center of your project, but that doesn't mean you need to start exactly in the center. You just kind of want to start in the center and work your way out. That just mostly makes sure that your project is perfectly centered on your fabric. If you want to do the math and do the measuring to start in the top left corner, especially if you're someone who stitches by grid or likes to use the parking method or whatever, you can totally do that. But you'll want to count from the center of the project. It just involves more counting that way. So that way you can be sure your project will be centered. But that doesn't mean that I am going to start from this stitch right here because it's in the very center. I am going to start at a place that makes sense that I can easily count to from the center. So I would probably start with this big group of these purple stitches here. But I don't want to start here and have to go this way and then finish it and then have to go this way. And I'm going to start right here. This is going to be my first stitch that I'm going to do in this project because I can make a sensible path through that whole block of that particular color. So I will count from the center that I marked on my project. 1, 2, 3 stitches left. 1, 2, 3 stitches up. So that is the starting point there. So I will load my fabric into my hoop, and remembering that my needle points up, I will count 3 stitches left and 3 stitches up, and that's where I'll make my first stitch. And then I will fill that piece in. That allows me to have sort of a better frame of reference to make sure that I don't make as many mistakes. So those are the steps that I take when starting out with a new project that I'm not working from a kit. What about you? Is there something you do different or something you feel like I missed? Leave it in the comments down below. But that is all I have for you this week. I do want to thank you so much for watching. For Caterpillar Cross Stitch, my name is Ford, and I will see you next week.